In the long, quiet corridors of New England's hospitals, few names carried as much warmth as hers. She was known for her calm demeanor, her tireless care, and the way she stayed by her patients' sides long after others had gone home. They called her Jolly Jane, a nickname earned not from loud laughter or grand gestures, but from the quiet cheer she brought to even the darkest rooms. She was the nurse people requested by name, the one families trusted when everything else felt uncertain. Her presence was comforting, her routine precise. She took notes diligently, administered medication with steady hands, and listened to the suffering with the patience of someone who truly cared. In a time when medicine could do little, and pain was often endured in silence, Jane made people feel seen. But in hospitals, death is no stranger. And over time, it became harder to ignore just how often it followed her. Elderly patients declined faster than expected. Charts didn't always match symptoms, and those closest to her seemed to vanish without notice. At first, no one asked questions. She had been there too long, had done too much good. Suspicion didn't come naturally, not when someone had spent years being a symbol of compassion. Yet behind the smile, behind the practiced kindness, was something else entirely. Jane Toppan didn't just want to comfort her patients, she wanted to control how their stories ended. And in doing so, she built a legacy not of healing, but of silence. A silence so deep it took decades to break. She wasn't born Jane. Her real name was Honora Kelly, a child of Irish immigrants, born into a home marked by poverty, instability, and silence. Her mother died of illness when she was still very young, and her father, mentally unwell and prone to violence, was known more for the stories whispered about him than for any presence in her life. By the age of 8, Honora had been placed in the Boston Female Asylum. Despite its name, it was not a place of safety or recovery. It was an orphanage in all but name, a holding space for girls without futures. A few years later, she was taken in by Anne Toppan, not as a daughter, but as an indentured servant. Anne didn't approve of Irish names. She insisted the girl change hers to something more respectable. From that point forward, Honora ceased to exist. The girl became Jane. She worked in silence, cleaning floors, fetching water, serving meals, always careful not to ask for more than was offered. There was no affection, no nurturing, only a constant awareness that she was allowed to stay so long as she remained useful. Even after she came of age and was technically free, Jane never truly left the household. She continued to serve, continued to follow the rhythm of someone else's life. Anne had a biological daughter, Elizabeth, who lived with a quiet kind of privilege, a woman who had never been renamed, never been made to feel temporary. Jane watched from the margins as Elizabeth was given the kind of acceptance she herself had never known. The lines between duty and identity began to blur. Jane wasn't mistreated in any way that would leave visible scars, but what lingered was deeper. It was the way she was tolerated rather than welcomed, managed rather than raised. Over time, that quiet erasure did something to her. She learned to be agreeable, to anticipate what others needed before they said it. She smiled often, not because she felt joy, but because it was the most effective way to remain unchallenged. For the first time in her life, Jane found herself in an environment where she wasn't just tolerated, she was needed. Nursing school offered a structure that no household ever had. There were rules, expectations, consequences, but also opportunity. No one there called her a servant. No one reminded her she didn't belong. Instead, her quiet diligence was seen as strength, not submission. And the precision that had once made her invisible in a family home now set her apart in a ward full of noise and need. She worked long shifts, picked up duties no one else wanted, and learned quickly how to calm panic with a single glance or gesture. The same emotional discipline she had once used to survive became the very thing that earned her praise. She didn't have to raise her voice to lead. She didn't have to ask for trust. It was given again and again. People began to describe her as cheerful, even comforting. She earned the nickname Jolly Jane, not because she was outwardly joyful, but because she made people feel at ease, even in pain, even in fear. The label gave others a way to understand her, to define her in simple, comforting terms. And Jane embraced it, not because it was true, but because it gave her something stable to stand on, an identity she could control, shape, and use. What no one realized was that she had become an expert in reading what people wanted. She knew how to deliver the version of herself that others needed most. The more they believed in her, the less they questioned her. And the less they questioned, the freer she became. No one asked about her past. No one thought to. She had erased it too well. But beneath the uniform, beneath the practiced smile, something deeper had taken root. Recognition wasn't enough. She didn't just want to be appreciated, she wanted to be essential. The kind of presence no one dared to replace. The name people whispered when life was slipping and trust became more important than medicine. Because when people gave her that kind of trust, no one ever questioned what she did with it. Nothing about Jane's outward behavior changed. She still showed up early, stayed late, and never raised her voice. To everyone around her, she remained the same dependable nurse, gracious, competent, tireless. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. What had once been empathy began to turn into something more calculating. She started to observe suffering, not as something to relieve, but as something to study. When patients winced in pain or grew disoriented from medication, she watched closely, not out of concern, out of interest. There was something in that moment of helplessness that held her attention in a way nothing else did. In the busy rhythm of hospital life, no one noticed when she lingered by a bedside a little too long, when she adjusted a dose slightly higher or waited just a few extra minutes to administer a sedative. It was always explained away as attentiveness. Jane knew how to mask experimentation as care. She began to test how subtle changes affected her patients, not to heal them faster, but to see how close she could bring them to the edge and pull them back. Some recovered more slowly than they should have. Others slipped into confusion, then clarity, then confusion again. She took no notes but remembered everything. The symptoms, the intervals, the way their eyes moved when they no longer understood what was happening. There was no anger in her, no cruelty on the surface, only control, quiet, methodical, precise. In a place where decline was expected and death came often, Jane found a terrifying kind of freedom. She had discovered that the more people trusted her, the more invisible her actions became. And in that invisibility, she realized she could shape someone's experience of illness, moment by moment, without leaving a trace. The people around her still saw what they wanted to see. To them, she was still the devoted nurse who worked tirelessly, never sought praise, and treated every patient as if they were family. But inside, something had already shifted. Jane no longer responded to pain out of duty or compassion. She had learned to use it. Her methods grew more deliberate. She began choosing who would receive comfort and who would not. The frightened were soothed, the lonely were surrounded, but those she found irritating or simply uninteresting were treated differently, though never in ways anyone would notice. Her status within the hospital allowed her room to maneuver. Doctors signed off without reading too closely. Families were grateful simply for her presence. No one questioned her judgment because no one believed she could ever be the source of harm. That was all she needed. One patient died after a sudden and unexplained downturn. Another, stable for days, began to drift within hours. Jane recorded symptoms carefully, shaped the narrative before anyone else could, and delivered the news with the practiced grief of someone who had seen too much. But behind each case was a calculated progression. She wasn't just testing thresholds anymore, she was orchestrating outcomes. She combined sedatives and stimulants in ratios no one else would have considered. She withheld relief just long enough to watch the mind unravel, then administered the final dose with precise timing. And as her confidence grew, so did her reach. She no longer confined herself to the hospital. She began visiting people she knew outside, offering help before they asked for it, inserting herself into moments of illness and stress, always under the guise of concern. There were no shift changes to answer to, no senior staff reviewing her decisions. She was in control from the moment she entered the room. And in those homes, quiet, private, unsupervised, Jane took full authorship. She decided who lived, who lingered, and when the story would end. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It wasn't just between nurse and patient. It was systemic. Because every time she walked through another door, every time she offered help with a smile, the world let her in, convinced they were being cared for, never suspecting they were being chosen. The damage didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, just like her crimes had. Quiet, calculated, and shielded by the very trust she had spent years cultivating. There were questions at first, scattered, uncertain. A death here, a discrepancy there. Records that didn't align with observed symptoms. Medications logged but not prescribed. Yet nothing seemed significant enough to raise alarm, at least not on its own. Jane had worked in too many places, passed through too many lives, and left behind too many stories that painted her as devoted, capable, selfless. She wasn't someone people suspected. She was someone they called for help. But as the whispers grew louder, as families compared timelines and doctors reviewed old charts, the illusion began to fracture. In hospital wards and private homes alike, patterns started to emerge, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just professional patients who had died unexpectedly. It was acquaintances, employers, even those she claimed to care about. The common thread wasn't illness. It was her. A physician finally pushed for an investigation, and once the records were reviewed, the discrepancies no longer looked like human error. They looked like intention, sedatives given without cause, dosages far too high, belongings missing from drawers, logs rewritten, deaths classified as natural when they were anything but. When detectives arrived at her door, Jane didn't panic. She asked if she could put on another dress before coming with them. Then she gathered her things, offered a quiet nod, and followed them out without protest, as if this too was part of a routine she already understood. She didn't need to fight. She had always relied on appearing harmless. And now, even as suspicion closed in, she carried herself with the same poise that had once made her invisible. But this time, someone had finally looked long enough to see past the performance. And what they found wasn't just disturbing, it was systematic. Behind the kindness, the calm voice, the reputation she had so carefully protected was a record of loss that could no longer be explained away. In the years that followed her arrest, the people who had once trusted Jane Toppan found themselves caught between memory and reality. To them, she had been a calming presence, a woman who moved quietly, worked diligently, and seemed to carry other people's pain with a kind of grace. Now, those same people were left questioning every gesture they had once seen as kindness. The media attempted to define her with headlines and labels. Some referred to her as deranged, others as a manipulator. But in court, the process was far less dramatic than the press imagined. She was declared legally insane and committed to a state asylum, bypassing the public reckoning many had hoped for. Inside those walls, her life became the subject of investigation, not just by doctors, but by an entire generation of forensic experts who came to see her as a case study in hidden pathology. Her presence became a subject of analysis, examined in interviews, documented in reports, and quietly filed into the history of medical crime. In time, she confessed to more than 30 deaths. There was no manifesto, no detailed explanation, just scattered admissions, vague recollections, and a chilling sense of certainty. She offered little motive, only the unsettling impression that ending a life had become, to her, a kind of practice. Jane wasn't seeking revenge. She didn't act from hatred or even desperation. What emerged instead was the portrait of someone who had come to see trust itself as a mechanism to control, one she could access through care and manipulate without force. Today, her name remains etched in the records of criminal psychology, not only because of the number of cases she was connected to, but because of the way she operated within spaces designed for healing. As a female serial killer, she shattered assumptions about who is capable of long-term, methodical harm, especially in institutions meant to preserve life. Her story continues to appear in true crime documentaries, casebooks, and classroom discussions. But more than a headline, she has become a symbol of failure, not just personal, but institutional. She represents what happens when oversight becomes routine, when compassion is assumed, and when a familiar face goes unexamined for too long. The final years of her life were quiet. She remained in institutional care, largely withdrawn, her reputation sealed by the silence she had once used to move undetected. She offered no further statements, and there were no legal appeals made on her behalf. But her legacy hasn't faded. Because Jane Toppan didn't simply break trust. She reshaped how we understand safety, how we train care providers, and how we define danger in its most unassuming form.